Okay, well, let's get started. I'm Tom Meixner. I'm the chair of the Cienega Watershed Partnership, and I've been the host for these lunch and learns for the last year or so. And I just want to put in the chat a couple things. One is our Cienega Watershed Partnerships website at cienega.org. And then we also have a bonfire store where you can get cool Cienega Creek swag like this shirt or the ever-pervasive coffee mug. You can go to those links and we get, some portion of the proceeds from that. So that's always appreciated. And then today, our speaker is Dr. Laura Norman, who is, as the slide notes, a research physical scientist at the US Geological Survey here in Tucson. Laura's done a variety of things over the years, looked at land use change, watershed modeling, but today she's going to talk about some of the work she's been doing recently, and recently is both very recently, but over the last several years, working on sort of rangeland modifications and rock detention structures and how they can change hydrology or not here in our Sky Island systems, and how that might improve water resources in our region. But I'll let Laura take it away from there. I'm sure you'll find her a dynamic and engaging speaker as she always is. So thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm looking at you, your names there. Thank you for logging in to hear me this afternoon. So I'm going to just start off with talking about the USGS a little bit. And changes in the environment, land use, and climate can have significant impacts on our nation's economy, natural resources, infrastructure, and water, food, and energy security. To strengthen our nation's ability to respond and adapt to these stressors, the USGS Land Change Science Program conducts research to improve understanding of rates, causes, and consequences of climate and land use change. To that end, my interest is in watershed management and how humans can slow or reverse some of these drivers or reduce impacts of negative consequences of land use and climate change. And those are generally referred to as best management practices in the watershed management realm. In the cities, aesthetically pleasing solutions to treat stormwater and provide other benefits include urban BMPs. So some examples portrayed here are green infrastructure, GI, low impact development, LID, and also sustainable drainage systems, SUDS. I just learned that one, so I think it's exciting to put it down. In agricultural settings, riparian buffers are valuable as well as fencing. And you can see in this picture before and after on the right-hand side of the screen, putting fences up for removing cows. In watersheds, the focus is on stream bank stabilization, floodplain restoration, and using detention structures. Rock detention structures like check dams and gabions have been well documented and internationally utilized for hundreds of years. Examples of these structures include spreaders, loose rock check dams or gully plugs, and larger rock-filled wire baskets or gabions that are installed in stream channels. Dave Rosgen was a U.S. Forest Service hydrologist who developed a method for classifying streams in the 1960s and teaches restoration classes based on his NCD approach. These are often required by agencies issuing stream permits. I put a little list of agencies where that's required or adopted by. In the desert Southwest, Bill Zedike, also a retired U.S. Forest Service guy, and Van Clothier in New Mexico have modified this to promote increased meander using small, but also low-tech structures. One example is a one rock dam. And we can't forget the beaver, who by damming streams create and enhance wetland habitat. In August 1950, beaver paratroopers were actually launched by the Idaho Department of Fish and Game as outpost agents of flood control and soil conservation. Nowadays, they are brought in a little less aerodynamically. agencies are reintroducing beavers into strategic locations for the benefit of wildlife, fisheries, and local water users. I should probably have a picture there of Catlow last week bringing a beaver into the San Pedro, but I didn't have that. We were able to monitor this little guy in the Baba Kamari a couple years ago, and you can see the beautiful dam that he built and the pond that he enjoys and work he has done in these photos. And you can see that he's obviously been very busy. Detention structures are not a new technology. Indigenous communities in the southwestern US and Mexico have used rock dams to grow their crops and control erosion and flooding. And archaeologists have identified rock detention structures here dating from 1,000 years before the Common Era. Last October, our eco-hydrology team had the pleasure to go for a walk with the amazing doctors Paul and Susie Fish from the School of Anthropology at the university, thanks to Ben Wilder at Tumamoc. They showed us the terrace fields around Tucson where Hohokam people had used rock structures to grow agave for fiber, food, and alcohol, some dating back to 1500 BC. The archaeologists had seen it and the restoration practitioners were doing it, but for some reason their approaches were being met with skepticism and doubt. Agencies and funders want metrics associated with the products to leverage grant dollars. There was a need for research and applied science that made use of modern technology in conjunction with the traditional knowledge. The Arid Land Water Harvesting Project is working to provide quantifiable results describing the impacts of various management practices on water, soils, and vegetation, eco-hydrology. In 2014, a consortium of local agencies began working to share and integrate conservation efforts in the Madre and Sky Island archipelago to conduct landscape level resource assessment at multiple watershed scales to evaluate condition and prioritize areas and methods for restorative treatment that could be collaborated on. The USGS worked with this collaborative to identify where structures were most effective based on the ecosystem services they provided. I didn't mean for that to do that. I don't know why I have that animation. Okay, so using the science now known as ecohydrology, a subdiscipline of hydrology that focuses on ecological processes occurring within the hydrologic cycle and strives to utilize such processes for enhancing environmental sustainability. So a bunch of keywords there. The general assumption of ecohydrology is to reverse degradation and achieve sustainable water and ecosystems in anthropogenically modified basins. Now I'm going to present step by step some of the research methods that we're using and start with remote sensing. Here's an example of what people on the ground have been seeing over time. These gabion structures were installed 25 years ago, and the impacts are qualitatively convincing. We use the USGS Landsat imagery over time to analyze change. Specifically, we looked at vegetation health around structures as an indicator of water availability using the very common NDVI index. Managers at both the refuge and at CLO had been installing gabion structures in and around the historic Cienega. We partitioned out areas to observe those that were treated with gabions and selected areas that had not been as controls. Over the 27-year study, we documented, following the red line, vegetation died or declined at most of our control targets, correlating with declines in precipitation in blue. But following the green line, vegetation was maintained and improved at most of our targets treated with structures, despite drought conditions. Looking spatially at the control versus treated in this map, the treated sites are delineated with the little X. Circles with no X were controls. You may notice right away that the majority of circles with little X's are colored green, representing increased health. Circles colored brown are representing decreased health. This brought our attention to this large green circle down here that had no X and no treatment. We wanted to investigate the area and extended our study to examine it. Here, Natalie Wilson used the index analysis that she had developed for her master's thesis in Cienega Creek Watershed to discern wetland area using satellite imagery using another index, the NDII, and extended our study to better examine upstream and downstream zones. Our analysis reiterated the potential of structures to support healthy vegetation that we had seen and extended the results to include areas up to 5 kilometers downstream from structures and 1 kilometer upstream. So it's a big area. We also use terrestrial LiDAR to document dimensions of study areas. So another remote sensing technique in terms of baseline geomorphology and in time series to analyze change. For example, here is what a gabion structure installed at Vaughan Canyon looked like in a three-dimensional model on the left. On the right is a map of spatial change over time at a channel in Patagonia at the Deep Dirt Farm. The laser scanning provides high-resolution quantification of change that can portray how structures impact erosion and sediment patterns. Structures are inside the circles here and are increased elevation installed after the first survey. Note the deposition in between and erosion up and downstream. And now I'm going to talk about some of the monitoring that we've done. At the El Coronado Ranch in the Chiricahua Mountains, where a rancher has installed 2,000 structures in this watershed alone, we developed a paired watershed study to compare the impacts with a watershed that had no structures. We installed a modified CSA gauge to calculate discharge based on stage data, surveyed cross-sections, and estimates of channel roughness in each of the paired watershed outlets. Our results portray a decrease in average flashiness related to peak flows in the treated watershed for small to medium flood events, and an increase in surface water availability in the treated watershed by extending the duration and season of flow events, as well as increased volumes by 28%. So I'm going to step through this just for a second with you, and you can try to picture in your head a normal monsoon and the timeliness over the summer. In July, we saw runoff occurring in the control, but not the treated watershed. It was harvesting water. In August, the percent rainfall to runoff was about equal in both watersheds. But in September, the treated watershed was portraying more than double that percent ratio. Water was held in the system and slowly released over time. In 2015, we were working at the Baba Kamari Ranch in a tributary of the San Pedro to identify the recharge potential of structures with Borderlands Restoration Network, funded by the Walton Family Foundation. A master's candidate at the time, Chloe Fandel from the U of A, worked with us to instrument a gabion with wildlife cameras, buried temperature loggers, and pressure transducers. The results from this analysis portray an increased soil moisture by 10%. In another study, CERC partners under the charge of Deborah Toslin at the Bureau of Reclamation in the city of Phoenix, we did some analysis at the Boy Scout Herd Scout Pueblo study site. One Rock Dam structures were installed by a company called Natural Channel Design, modeled by the Bureau of Reclamation and monitored by the USGS using a suite of devices, including pressure transducers and cameras. Results mimic the results we had in the Chiricahuas and the Baba Kamari, with decreases in peak flows and increases in infiltration at structures. Results also suggest a 3-degree microclimate cooling effect for at least 2 days following rainfall events at treated sites. This climate mitigation strategy of installing structures would likely have cumulative cooling effects, and our preliminary findings are extremely promising. We started to double and triple our measurements to better compare the parts of the water budget. Our current study is examining a leaky weir over by the Wilcox Playa. Using water level loggers, wildlife cameras, crest stage gauges with logging temperature sensors, terrestrial LiDAR surveys, drone surveys, fish and wildlife surveys. This is a work in progress, but having the hydrological data set available, now describing 2 years of monitoring, and will be released this month. An analysis to better understand what is happening to the system will follow. In addition, we're also working with a hydrology student, Diana Shea, to develop research describing the surface to groundwater interactions and potential for recharge enhancements by structures using isotope analysis. In 2015, we launched a field campaign at 6 study sites to document vegetation changes, spearheaded by Natalie Wilson. Within plots, nested quadrats were used to measure frequency and quantify abundance during the monsoon growing season. Basal and foliar cover classes were also recorded for each quadrat. Short-term and local response at structures and expected long-term landscape level response throughout the system is being documented. Preliminary results show increases in perennial vegetation, mimicking the remote sensing analysis we had done. This 5-year data collection is also scheduled to be released this week. Then the real analysis can commence, examining changes in abundance by life form and family, changes in wetland species occurrence, and invasion of non-natives. We're also exploring how sediment deposition at structures might influence soil carbon storage by analyzing isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen. Results portray rock detention structures increasing carbon cycling and soil carbon storage within treated watersheds. Also of interest, watersheds treated by structures prior to fire demonstrate an increase of stored carbon. Now I'm going to talk about watershed modeling. That's my favorite subject. Ambos Nogales flooding is an annual issue that threatens livelihoods and lives of people living in environmental justice communities. In 2010, an initial model iteration identified locations for potential human intervention and risk. In this case, we see areas in the watershed where high runoff is expected, which could be focused on for flood management. The US International Boundary and Water Commission commissioned us to determine efficacy of flood detention structures at selected locations using the same model. In this example at Cuesta Blanca, peak flows were reduced for a small event, a 10-year, 1 hour. But efficacy was negated in the larger events. You can see that those hydrographs are almost matched in a 100-year event. Our results portrayed high sediment deposition at all of the proposed structures and identified a need for regular maintenance to ensure sustainability. There's been a lot of updates to this over the past 10 years, including emergency flood warning systems and new data acquisition, discharge, rainfall, etc. in the basin. Last year, working with Dr. Francisco Lara at ASU and others, we were funded by the NADBank to extend model results to evaluate and advance green gray infrastructure to reduce and control transboundary flows during wet weather in Ambos Nogales. Dr. Lara is giving a USGS science seminar on May 26th at noon if you're interested, and I will forward Tom the details to log in. Models can estimate areas of high surface runoff, sediment yield, and percolation distributed in watersheds. This can save time and money from the previous approach, which is just a hope that it works. Estimates of surface runoff, sediment yield, and percolation can be made and distributed in watersheds. Based on these predictions, restoration practitioners and engineers can determine how big structures need to be, how many need to be installed, and determine best locations to situate them. Check dams are known to impact routing processes, altering the fate and transport of water quality constituents like sediment and nutrients. I calibrated the soil and water assessment tool using the discharge measurements that we had collected in the field in our paired watershed study in the Chiricahuas to extrapolate and extend the analysis over a 3-year simulation to examine the impact of structures on sediment yield. Model results depict a minimum precipitation event of just over ½ an inch to instigate the detachment of soil, sediments, or rock from the study area, which occurred about 2% of the total time in the 3-year simulation. Mean annual soil loss in the treated watershed was predicted to be about 792 tons per year, where about 210 tons of sediment was estimated to be stored behind the check dams per year. It would take 5 years for the structures to capture 1,000 tons of sediment, which is about how much this boulder weighs. Using the sediment yield estimates derived from the calibrated SWAP model and taking into account the size of the watershed and number of structures, we used James's isotope analysis results to estimate the rate of carbon capture for rock detention structures, about 200 to 250 metric tons of carbon per hectare. That is equivalent to the amount of what is stored in wetlands. Using the terrestrial LiDAR we had collected in the field, I applied the IRIC model solver, NAIS 2DH, to predict change in stream flows and stages based on the changed elevation. Here I am portraying the depths of water depicted, which is the color change, and the velocity, which is the arrows, when a small event is simulated. Location of rock detention structures are shown by the black circles. On the left, I'm showing the geomorphology in 2013 with simulated gabions and one rock structures. On the right, I'm showing what it looked like in 2015 when the structures had actually been installed. Sediment had shifted and the same discharge was simulated in the study. The model allowed us to identify where water would be pushed to breach the channel on the left, so gabions could be installed in higher elevations there. The model also portrayed increases in depths of water harvested and decreased velocity when gabions are installed. The same model can also predict bed form shift and geomorphology changes around structures. The map on the left depicts erosion and deposition results that the NAIS 2DH model iteration run on the 2013 DEM. And on the right, you may recall, is the actual change in elevation that we had measured using the repeat LiDAR surveys. Both maps are overlain on the 2015 hillshade and portrayed using graduated colors to show deposition gradients in blue and erosion gradients in red. You notice the color schemes are correlated where the model is used to predict erosion and sedimentation and shifts. Here is a list of quantifiable benefits of rock detention structures that has resulted from all of this study. I'm going to read through them all. So the decrease in peak flows for small to medium flood events, a decreased stress in plants and associated vegetation health, so increase in habitat and biodiversity, increase in surface water availability at sites, 5 kilometers downstream and 1 kilometer upstream, extending seasonal flows and increased volumes by 28%, increased organic matter in soils, so carbon sequestration, increased soil moisture at structures by 10%, decreased sedimentation downstream, and benefit from modeling before installation occurs. And recently somebody asked me if these numbers would hold across the line. And the answer that I gave her was no, because these are just all studies that we've done at specific sites. And so these are just examples of what we found, and there'd be a need to do a lot more studies in order to make some generalizations, but I think it's promising. Throughout my talk, I've been describing years of scientific research analyzing impacts of rock detention structures documented by the USGS Arid Land Water Harvesting Study. These results are presented as major ecosystem services, including flood detention, habitat provisioning, water and erosion regulation, carbon sequestration, and climate regulation. And that was all summarized and published last year in a special issue of the Air, Soil, and Water Research Journal, along with a series of case studies from our CERC cooperative. Partners developed manuscripts describing historic wildfires and risks, planting pallets to support pollinators, impacts of restoration on vegetation and birds, documenting the need for wildlife corridors for busy roadways, and describing the Borderlands Earth Care Youth Institute, along with some of the articles I've already presented. And a co-authored editorial introducing it all is now online. I'm wrapping up early, and I apologize that I maybe made this too short, but I've included some links on my closing slide here if you'd like to follow up with any of the subjects that I touched upon today. And I would also welcome any questions if people want to talk about it.
That was great, Laura. I'm sure there will be some questions, but while we're waiting for participants to sort of either show up in the chat or by phone, I have a question, sort of, right? So these structures get built, I mean, I guess, and you focused on sort of their benefits, but what's sort of the lifetime of these structures? What sort of maintenance costs are there? And then what happens if they do fail? Like, how does that then impact these landscapes?
Okay, so the first thing I caught was the lifetime of the structures, and
Right.
yeah, there's really, it's again, it's the same, it's kind of the same answer that I gave that I gave my colleague yesterday, is that it's dependent. So it depends on what you're doing. So in the case of the structures that are being installed by CLO, for example, we're looking at 30 years out and structures are still there. Perhaps they've tumbled down, but they're still holding soil and water back despite
Sure.
having crumbled. And a lot of those are also filled in with sediment. And so
Right.
the maintenance of those hasn't been to clear out the sediment like you would see in a detention basin, but rather to allow them to fill in and then to build new structures on top of them. And so it depends on, again, what the cause of the structures are being installed for. If they're being installed for flood detention, like in Nogales, we had identified that there was a dire need for maintenance if the structures were being filled in. But in the case of habitat provisioning, just building new structures on top seems to be appropriate. So
Yeah.
kind of dependency.
Yeah, I mean, there's dependence on the landscape, but like you said, decadal scales, minimums for sort of lifetime, and then maintenance is dependent upon application, right? In an urban area like Nogales, where the need for just retaining any and all flood flows is going to be different than a rangeland where the sediment and vegetation recruitment is what it's more. There's great benefits from those as well. So.
Yes, and I would even say it goes beyond decadal because of the structures that the Dr. Fish showed us.
Yeah.
The Tumamog, those, certainly exceed that, but it depends again, how the climate and the location and yeah.
Right. There any questions from audience members? I know several of them are pretty knowledgeable about these sorts of practices or similar practices in other environments. So.
You can turn on your screen and talk too if you want, instead of typing.
You can, yeah.
Typing.
The voice and face are nice. So.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to Tom's question about longevity of these things. And so I build mostly one rock dams. And overall, we have a plus 90% rate of no degradation to these structures. And then we also design them where in 5-10 years, we want to go back in and add a second one to the top of it after it's been filled in with sediment. So I consider these long-term installations.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys were doing any monitoring about, what you've been, I know you've been doing a lot of work in Seneca Creek yourself right now, Trevor, with these structures. So are you monitoring?
Yeah. Unfortunately, our monitoring is just photo point monitoring. And then we've gotten a bit of money from corporations who are doing water offsets. So we do estimate how much infiltration we're getting behind each of these structures based on width and height and the size of the watershed. But yeah, I'm going to be reaching out to you, Laura, because I have an intern that I would like to start doing a little bit more intensive monitoring of these structures. So we'll need your help.
That's great. I'd love to hear more about your water offsets funding mechanisms as well. So
yeah.
Kurt Vaughn had a question, wondering, right? So you noted, right, the benefit of modeling beforehand, right? And sort of understanding the context in which these projects are being done, I guess. And he's wondering how we can get to a place where pre-modeling can become a regular and cost-affordable addition to these sort of detention system rock detention system structures? So.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that I have been asked before. I think Brad Lancaster asked me 5 years ago, what could he use as tools? And the USGS actually has a website that I shared with him where you can get estimates of discharge at any site in Arizona right now. You can see, what is the potential peak flows, and so that tool is really remarkable for just understanding the amounts of water that might be running through an area. I'm spacing the name of that tool, but maybe somebody can help me.
Yeah. Well, while we're hunting for that, Larry Fisher had a question, right? So, you summarize these ecosystem service benefits, but I guess, he's wondering, are you aware of any of the economic studies of the benefits of these structures that show cost, benefit, and effectiveness?
Yeah, I actually looked into that a little bit when I was developing this presentation on the screen with the Jaguar, and I had identified some estimates that a land trust company had come up with in Colorado that looked at ecosystem services of wetlands. And there was some values that they had identified there that I thought would be applicable for structures. But I think it's something that could definitely be investigated more, especially in relationship to the cost of structures in comparison of benefits. So cost of benefits and cost of structures.
Yeah. I mean, I think the costs of construction, I think, are relatively straightforward to estimate and calculate. I think the ecosystem service benefits, I mean, it seems like George Friswold or Bonnie Colby maybe, or others could be lassoed in to do that sort of analysis. Sort of is definitely something to keep in the back of my head. So yeah. Let's see. Roy Petrakis, right? Scale of these systems is dependent on the situation, but could these sorts of structures be placed along large river systems? For example, the Santa Cruz River south of Tucson and other larger systems. Would you expect to see similar benefits of these structures within these systems?
Well, good question, Roy. In the San Bernardino watershed, they certainly are putting very large structures in systems that compare with the Santa Cruz, and they're very successful, I would say. There was a 1,000-year event that came through and washed some of them out recently. I guess recently, Odile. I don't know if that's really more, but
I was thinking the same thing. Like, we get these titanic floods on the Santa Cruz, and I know like flood control is used, like they call them like 10-year rock structures to try to manage the river a little bit better in the effluent dominated reach, so that it isn't running up against their soil cemented walls. But their ambition there is noted by the 10-year rock.
Yeah, I've seen the county has some experimental stuff with barbs and that kind of to create the meander, and that seems to be pretty effective.
Yeah.
So I think in certain situations, it just depends on the situation, I guess.
Yeah.
Like the concrete would certainly limit it.
Yeah. Other questions from folks? Okay. Well, I mean, that was very nice, Laura. Insightful, and again, the scope of this work, and like you were noting, right, the historical and literally prehistorical work, but this longstanding indigenous practice that's also been adopted by ranchers historically and currently, and then by agencies of various sorts, is always notable. It's sort of something about this landscape people don't think about, but when you're out there, sometimes you can see we oftentimes think of these desert and rangeland areas as almost wildlands, but they've obviously been inhabited by people for a long time, and modifying them in subtle and more overt ways. So Well, thank you, Laura. Let's thank Laura again.